Jason Beck, thank you so much for the intro. And may I also thank you, Mr. Beck, President Beck, for the article that I'm about to share with you all today. I appreciate you putting this on my radar.
Yes.
It is from the Washington Post, from columnist Joe Davidson. Read a few of his pieces, and the title is "Ohio's Weed Win Brings New Attention to Feds and Marijuana Use." It's a bit of a longer article, and I know we're getting tighter on time, so I'm going to run through it. Recreational or adult use marijuana's strong victory in red state Ohio last week means legalized cannabis will soon be available to more than half of the U.S. population. But current and potential federal employees and contractors are not allowed to indulge no matter where they live. Despite the steady legalization among states since 2002 and a Gallup poll released this month showing approval from a record 70% of Americans, marijuana possession remains a federal crime and major. Let's see. And it still prohibits their use, right? So there is hope, however, for these who use cannabis in medical for medical reasons and others, or just to get high. The outside the Beltway developments have drawn increased attention to little notice. Bipartisan congressional legislation approved with a 30-14 vote in September by the House Committee of Oversight and Accountability. The Cannabis Users Restoration and Eligibility, the CURE Act, would prohibit federal employees from using prior, but not current, marijuana consumption as grounds for blocking federal employment or security clearances. Democrats were unanimous in the support, while Republicans split the vote, 14 voting no and 10 voting yes. So there's no guarantee that the quickly increasing public support for legalized cannabis will result in quick cure action by Congress. Diane Goldstein, executive director of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, urged members of Congress to heed the, quote, resounding rejection from our nation's long history of criminalization, end quote, align with their constituents to promptly passing the CURE Act, which will ensure the federal government no longer disqualifies promising candidates simply because of marijuana use. Now, this is personal for one lawmaker, according to this article, Nancy Mace, a co-sponsor of the bill. She didn't vote in the Ohio approval from other Republicans to push or ease restrictions against cannabis use. Unlike others at the meeting, Mace spoke about being raped at the age of 16 and using prescribed antidepressants that, quote, made me want to kill myself. She said that cannabis, quote, saved my life. She added that anyone that was in the same position that I was should not be penalized for using something that has saved their lives. I'm going to go a little bit deeper down into this article because there's a few interesting quotes. Let's see. Sorry, I just lost my spot. Down here. Sorry, Jay. So there was a bill opponent, Pete Sessions, Republican from Texas. He warned that, quote, moving for the sake of to expedite without proper consideration of whether there are national security risks in doing so. His office did not reply to a request for specifics on how the bill and marijuana consumption might increase risks. There's another quote I want to share that comes from a retired DEA officer, and he says that I've never had to fight anyone that was smoking a joint. Those guys are sitting on the couch, man, eating Oreos and watching cartoons. I found it very interesting that this former police officer promoted the reclassification by saying that. And then also to a couple other points earlier in articles that were shared by some of the doctors about poly use. They didn't classify it that way, but essentially, describing how people react differently to different drugs. I found that quote to be a little bit interesting here. So I don't know how the Ohio vote is going to affect this in the big picture, in the big scheme of things, but as of right now, it looks like there are quite a few people looking into marijuana use and how it could prohibit federal employees, federal contractors, and there are a ton of federal contractors, as we know. And how does that affect their employment? How does that affect their security clearances? And what is the path forward? I found this to be very interesting. It's a long article. Sorry for breezing through it. Curious to see what my correspondents have to say about this.
Let them smoke.
Let them smoke.
But that's not going to work out like that. It's not going to.
So real quick on this note, right? So I was recently talking to somebody within the SFPD who shared with me their new and revamped drug policy, which when I left, which was over 3 years ago, that policy was written and in existence since like the early 80s, I want to say. And there's a new policy that came out this year that basically says officers cannot use illegal drugs on duty. But I'll share it with you guys if you want, because I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. But reading between the lines, I interpret it as like they're not really asking. And as long as you're not using on duty, didn't call out cannabis specifically, but the way I read it was potentially loopholes to say, well, I'm using off duty. I wasn't using on duty, and therefore I did not violate this particular policy. So I'll share it with you
Or
guys after the show.
you're using legal drugs. They said illegal drugs, right? So an
Yep.
illegal drug has to be illegal. If it's legal in the state, it's legal in the state, right?
That's how I interpret it as well, doctor. I mean, listen, you've got like licensed dispensaries, tax-paying businesses in the city of San Francisco specifically, for example, right? And then you've got this policy that says we can't use illegal drugs. Now, I can promise you the department will say, well, it's federally illegal, and therefore we gotcha. But I promise you that, law enforcement acts on a case-by-case basis, and punishment is not handed out fairly by any means. It's not consistent. They definitely pick and choose how and when they want to discipline officers or not. So it's going to depend on the officer.
How ironic that the same officers won't enforce the federal law. They enforce local or state laws, right? Local or state law says that this is legal, right?
Right. And I've said this multiple times on this show and others that, it is not a cop's job to determine if the law is right or not. It is not their space.
It's their job to enforce it.
Or not, though, right? Use your common sense. Use
discretion, right? Discretion, officer discretion.
Jay, there are so many times when, in my opinion, common sense prevails. It's like, okay, is this person what this doing letter of the law, right? Illegal? Okay, letter of the law, yes, it's illegal. Spirit of the law, not illegal. Kick rocks, let's all bounce, right? But and that's dependent on what we're talking about. Obviously, that's not a blanket statement across the board, but all good talking points.
Without a doubt.
I think this is good because it's going to put pressure on the federal government, coming from Ohio, which which has its influence on both sides
it does.
of the aisle. I think it's going to really put more pressure for federal legalization.
I couldn't agree with you more on that, Dr. T.